In this video, I'm going to show you how to combine the power of Bubble applications with the power of Parabola workflows. So Bubble is a no-code platform that lets you build apps with visual programming. You do not have to know how to write code in order to create an app on Bubble. And Parabola is very similar. It lets you build automated workflows so that you can process data in really powerful ways, again, without writing a single line of code. So I'm going to show you how you can combine the power of both of these together to create some really awesome custom automations and workflows that will work specifically for what you are trying to build. So let's take a look at an example Bubble app that I have here. I'm just going to show you the two different data tables that we're going to be working with. The first one is a transaction data type. Let's say that this application is processing payments and it's recording the details for every transaction. So we have very simple fields here: a field for an amount, a field for the customer's email address, and a field for the customer's full name. So the first and last name would be in this single field here. If we go to the app data and take a look at that table here, I have some sample records. So you can see the different amounts, the different customer names. Some of them are repeats. So we have, the same customer creating separate transactions, and then their email addresses. And then the second data type we're going to look at is the user type. So this would be the actual login credentials, the user record for that person who might be related to one or more transactions. So the only thing we have going on here is the built-in email address and separate fields for the first and last name. Now, if we go over to the app data, I can see that I have 3 user records, one for each user, and I do not have anything saved to the first and last name fields. Okay, so let's say our situation is this. Our application is taking payments and it's creating separate transaction records for each of those payments. But we do not have a way to parse out the full name. The full name might be coming from the credit card entry where it's going into one single field. And this is what we know. This is how we're saving it. We want to be able to split up this name and save it to an associated user record with the name split up and parsed out. Now, there are several ways to do this within Bubble itself, but if your transaction data is coming from an outside source, or you're importing in data from a previous database and you want to bring it into Bubble and you need to kind of do some batch processing to split everything out and create your users. Lots of different reasons why you would start out here in this scenario here and will need something to help you parse out the full name and split them up into separate first and last name fields. So we can use Parabola to help us read all of the transaction data and split out the full name and send that data back to Bubble so that we can save everything split up, and then we can move on with our data and have everything organized properly. So I'm going to show you how to do this. The first thing you'll want to do is when you go to Parabola, we'll create a new flow after you've created an account. And I'm just going to give this flow a quick and easy name here, split full name. Okay, and the way Parabola works is you have a number of different action types. So Parabola looks for, will read data from a number of different sources. It can pull data from your Bubble app's data API, which I'll show you in a second. We are going to use that. Or it can pull directly from some third-party service like Dropbox or a file upload, a direct file upload, or Google Sheets, MailChimp. You can even pull in Stripe account information here. So take a look at all of the different options because this really creates some powerful connections to outside services. This, again, would be the list of your data source. So wherever Parabola is pulling or needs to pull from, this is the first step. You need to provide it with a data source. So in our case with Bubble, we're going to tell Parabola to go look at the data API for our Bubble app. The data API is basically what allows an external service to read your app's database. and look at all the records. So I'm going to use the API import, right? Because we're working with the data API. We're importing that into Parabola. So I'm just going to grab this, drag it, and drop it onto this area here. This is just kind of a canvas that you can place anything wherever you want. All right, so our data import, if we double click on this, we'll pull up the settings window to configure the API endpoint for to connect the data from Bubble to Parabola. All right, so where do we get this API endpoint? Let's go back to our Bubble app. The first thing you need to do is head over to your settings and then to API. And if you do not already have this exposed, you'll need to check Data API to expose it. And then you'll want to select the data types that you're wanting to expose. So I have transaction checked. I also need to check user here. I'm going to uncheck some of these other ones that I'm not using right now. And also go ahead and check this one. Use field display instead of ID for key names. It's going to make things easier to read when you're setting things up in Parabola. So check that. I'm also going to delete that. We don't need that there. So this is Data API. This now kind of enables, it kind of switches the feature on so that external services can access your database via API. The URL endpoint for some external service to call, it's like an address for specific databases, is going to be structured like this. It's going to be your Bubble apps domain. Now, this could be the domain on the Bubble hosted domain. So if you create an app for the first time, or you're on the hobby plan and you don't have a custom domain set up yet, you're going to have the name of your app as a subdomain, and then it'll be .bubbleapps.io. But if you've already switched over to your custom domain, then this will just be your custom domain, something like myawesomeapp.com. And then the version of the database that you're looking for. So if you're wanting to test it out first, make sure you have version test, and this will pull from your development database. If you're looking at your live database, you won't want this here. You need to remove that. And then it's API/1.1. That's the version of the API that Bubble is on right now. And then /OBJ, which stands for object, and / then the name of the data type that you want to pull from. So in our case here with this example, we're pulling from the transaction data type. That is, again, if I go to my data types here, it's this one, transaction, because I want Parabola to read all of the transactions and find that full name field, because that's what it's going to need to split up. Okay, just a couple notes to keep in mind. This, when you enter in the name of your data type, it needs to be all lowercase. And if you have spaces, for example, if you had a 2-word like this billing date here, you should remove the space so that it's 1 word only. No spaces in the URL. Right, so I'm going to just copy this here and go back to my Parabola builder and enter this as the API endpoint. Great. And I do not have any authentication set up, but I'm going to show you what you need to do if you do want to create an API key so that your data is a little bit more protected. I do recommend it. And Parabola should only be accessing it if they have a right key. Let's run this right now without any authentication, just so that you can see some results show up here. So I'm going to click on this little icon there, and it's going to retrieve the data. And I can see right now my data is showing up there. I'm going to need to flatten it a little bit because it's kind of all combined into one big field, and we need to split it all up. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. But basically what it is finding, you can see if I hover over it there, the full result is there. And what it's finding is this here. This is the data for the transaction table that I have all split out. You can see each record pretty neatly there. And this is something you can do with all of your data types in Bubble, as long as you expose that particular type here under this API tab. If you were to try to reach one of these URLs and you had the data type not checked, Bubble's going to give you an authentication error. So this is very important here. All right, so we have the data there. We can see that it's pulling it in properly. It's able to read the data from my application. I'm going to go ahead and add an authentication method here. If you select bearer token, then you can type in the API key that you generate for this service specifically. And you can generate an API token in Bubble right underneath the data API section. You saw that I had one there before and I had removed it. I'm just showing you here from the beginning how you would create it. So you click on this button, generate a new API token, and here's the private key. And I can give this a name so that I know who's supposed to be using this. So I can type in Parabola. So I know this is where it's being used. I will copy that there, go back to my Parabola builder, and paste it in right there. And if I refresh just to make sure that Parabola still has access, we can see that they do. Now, to prevent access for, if anyone else wants to access the transaction table without an API key, I need to go into my data and then to privacy and head over to the transaction data type. You can see that the privacy role is visible to everyone. So I would need to define a new role and say, we'll create a role for logged in users. Now, a logged in user is not the same as someone who's accessing externally with an API key. I just need to be able to create one role so that I can turn off permissions for everyone else. But anyone with an API key is an exception to that. If they have an API key, they will have access regardless of what's going on here in your rules. But you do have to create at least one rule so that Bubble can actually enforce different permissions. So I'm just going to create a simple rule here. When current user is logged in, then they can do certain things, and then everyone else, we will turn this off. All right, so now if I go back to my Parabola builder, let's say that I do not have a token, and then I try to run this. I can see that the result I get is 0. I have no results because I do not have access to the data anymore. But if I put the key back in, bearer token, run this again, then I have the full response. All right, so that's how you can create a restriction to an external service using that API key method for your data API. All right, so that's just one piece of it. We've now connected successfully and securely access to our data. So now I need to flatten this out. This is all jumbled up in one single row. It's not very helpful. It's going to be difficult for Parabola to really extract all of the customer names there. So let's add a transform action after this import. I'm going to switch over to this filter here for all of my different operations. I'm going to hide that. I'm just going to go ahead and hide this menu. It might be in the way. All right. And we're going to use the flattener. Let's go find it here, JSON flattener. If you're not familiar with the structure of this data, this is in a JSON format. It makes your data legible and easy to find, values and extract them record by record. So that's the format that we're working with here. So I'm going to grab this JSON flattener and drag it over here. And then I'm going to connect the import to the JSON flattener by clicking on that arrow and dragging it and dropping it on top of that new action. Right? So this is now an operation that will be performed on the data that was imported. So I'm going to double click on this. And you can see that it's pulling in that same result, and it's saying, okay, what do we want to do with this, or how do we want to flatten this? So I'm going to flatten the columns, and you can actually have it exclude certain columns. So if you click this and you do all columns except, it should provide a list of them. But because everything, the way that Bubble sent all of the information is kind of mashed up into one single column, there's nothing for us to exclude. So we're just going to leave this with these columns like that. And I'm going to select the response. So that is you can see here at the top level, that's kind of what everything is nested within. So that's our only option here, is to flatten the response value. I'm going to hit update settings. And we're going to see it parsed out a little bit. So now we're starting to have things split up. This is one single row still. So I have an amount, an email, the creation, unique ID, whoever created the user, or sorry, the transaction, creation date, modified date. This is for one record. There's the customer full name. And then look what happens. I have another amount, email, other fields for this one record. And if I keep scrolling down, we go to the other one. So everything is flattened, which is good, but it's still only in one single row. We want to create a separate row for every transaction record. So we're going to follow this second step here, which is to expand the list into new rows. So I'm going to click this, and we want to expand our response results result that came out of that initial flattening. All right, so I'm going to update settings, and we'll see what we get. There we go. So now this is looking a lot better. Now for every single row, I have, it makes a lot more sense. This is actually a different row for a separate transaction. The amount, email, and then all of the other fields like the customer full name should be down there. There it is, right? And then we have all the other fields that are also coming from Bubble. But this is looking much better. Now we've really helped Parabola understand how the data is structured. So now that we have this flattened, we want to split up that name, that full name field. Parabola has a number of different transform actions available to you here. Some of these are incredibly powerful. Some of them are not possible in Bubble, actually, and at least not very easily. You'd have to really craft a custom solution within API workflows, or restructure your database so that different aggregations and data transformations happen. But Parabola is really, this is what they do really, really well, is they will transform data in practically any format so that you can extract whatever information you need from it, whether it's aggregations or creating new calculations of some kind, or just formatting it in a different way, splitting things up, combining things, removing duplicates. There's so much. So I really encourage you to check all of the different options out and see what might be useful for you. So there's one specifically for name parsing. So that's what we're going to choose here. I'm going to grab this one and drag it over to my flow. All right, and I'm going to again connect this step, the JSON flattener, over to the name parser. Great. Now I'm going to double click on the name parser so I can set it up. Basically, all I need to tell Parabola is where the full name field is and how I want it to parse. So the column to parse, I can look for it here. It's going to match up with whatever column has the full name. I believe it's just customer full name. This is how I named it in Bubble. And I can navigate to that here. Great. And then choose parts of name. So this is Parabola asking us how we want to parse out the name. Do we want to have the first, middle, and last? Do we want to have a salutation there? We're just going to keep it simple because we know, we can see from our data, we have a first and last. So I will type in first name and then last name, or not type in, I'm just selecting there. All right, so now I'm going to update settings to see how it transforms and parses out the names. So my results are ready. I'm going to scroll all the way to the right to see the updated results. And I can see here it successfully split up those names. It created two new columns for me, one for the first and one for the last. Awesome. So now I have my parsed out names coming from this action. Now I need to send this information back to Bubble. All right, so destinations, that's our next section here in the Parabola actions. Again, you have a number of different options for where you want to send the resulting data. It can be an API export, which is what we're going to use to send this back to Bubble. But it can also be other things. You can export files, you can post to Dropbox, you can send email attachments back to Google Sheets, so many different things, very, very useful. And this really allows you to create an awesome automated data tool. So we're going to use the API export. I'm going to drag this over here and connect the two. And by the way, these actions, you can have multiple actions being triggered from the same thing. So for example, if I wanted an API export as one of my destinations, but I also wanted a Google Sheet as a destination, I can do that as well. I can have the results here going to both. I could also have multiple sources being combined. Maybe I have my some old historical data in my app on transactions, but I also have new Stripe data coming in from an active Stripe account, and I can add that in here, and I can combine these together. Actually, you'd probably have to join. There's a separate transformation tool here that lets you join things this, just like this. I'm going to show you real quick. So if I have these two, these would both go to the join. You can see how easy it is to just kind of mix and match, move things around. All right, so there we go. So if I had these two sources, transaction data coming from my custom app, and then also transaction data coming from Stripe, I can join the two tables together, and then from there continue flattening things, parsing things out, and then spitting them back out and posting them to my custom app or to Google Sheets or to any other destination that's available here. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. I just wanted to show you real quick how powerful and flexible this can really get, and you can really customize some awesome flows. So I'm going to delete the Stripe, I'm going to delete the join, and I'm going to connect this back here. Okay, and I'm going to delete the Google Sheet, and great. Okay, let's just make sure that our name parsing is still, yeah, it looks like everything kept everything intact, so we don't need to run those again. Now, for the API export, so this is, again, looking for a URL to send the data back to. So in our Bubble app, we're going to use an API workflow. This is where we can create endpoints for some external service to send data to. So I'm going to go to, if you don't see this section in your application, API workflows, make sure you go over to the API tab. This is the same settings tab, API, where we enabled our data API. And you'll now want to expose your workflow API. When you have this checked, you'll see this at the very bottom of your page list. So I'm going to click on that, and let's go over to my Parabola folder here. I had already created that for this demo, and we're going to create our new endpoint. So I'll click here to add an endpoint, select new API endpoint, and we'll give this a name. I'm going to just use the word Parabola. All right, and this is another one too where you can create privacy rules so that only external services with a valid API key can run these workflows. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to leave this unchecked, and I do not want to ignore privacy rules. So Bubble is going to check for a valid API key, and I'm going to show you how to set that up in Parabola. Now, the endpoint itself, the full URL, the easiest way to grab this is if you set this up with a detect request data parameter definition here. Basically, this means Bubble needs to know the structure of the data that's coming in from Parabola. Parabola is going to send it in a specific format with a specific hierarchy of all of the fields and columns, and we need to know we need to tell Bubble how to read that. So the best way to do it is to kind of have Bubble automatically understand the structure of that data by using this here. If you were to select manual, you would have to create every parameter on your own. This detect request data feature lets you do things a little bit more automatically, which helps things out. So I'm going to select here, detect data. I'm going to click that. And you can see this is our API endpoint. Now, this is an initial step. The full endpoint, when you're running the workflows kind of in real time, when you're having Parabola do everything, it's going to be the same endpoint you see here, except for it's not going to have this initialize at the very end. This initialize is only to set up the endpoint. All right, so I'm going to show you. I'm going to click to copy here. I'm going to go back to my Parabola builder. This is a post call. Whenever you call your Bubble API endpoints, it will always be post. It's not anything else. And I'm going to paste in that endpoint that I copied. All right. Now, again, the initialize is just to set it up. So we're going to have to update this in a moment here to remove the word initialize. But we want to help Bubble read everything. Now, here's the authentication. I'm going to do bearer token and add in that same token. Let me cancel this for the moment. Go to settings, copy this token again. And back to Parabola, I'm going to paste that token in there. Now Parabola is allowed to send data to my app's workflow API. Okay, and everything else looks good. I don't think I need to, oh, actually we do want to define the different types of values that each of the column types are, just to help Bubble understand, is this a number, is this a text? I think the only ones we really want to adjust is that amount field. If I can find it. Here it is at the top, and I'll change that to number. Everything else can stay the same. It can all be strings. All right, so let's go ahead and update settings. Okay, so we can see that it's now enabled and no errors. I don't see any errors happening here. So now we can actually publish the flow, but remember we need to initialize this first. We are going to have to come back in here and remove the word initialize from this endpoint. So let's go ahead and publish it so that we can initialize, because we're not quite done with our setup here yet. I have all my steps. I'm going to click publish on the upper right corner. Okay, so my flow is published. I won't be able to edit anything while it's published. I would need to unpublish it to change anything, just FYI. And I can either create a schedule so that I can tell Parabola to run this flow on some recurring frequency. I can have it run daily, every Tuesday, whatever it might be. They have a whole scheduling system, which is really cool. Or I can choose to run this right now. I'm going to click this button, but before I do, I'm going to turn on the detect data again, because I need to have this window open in order to detect incoming data to finish this setup, to finish the initialization process. So we'll have that open. Now I'm going to run now, and it's asking me to confirm one more time. I'm going to run now, and you can see how it's processing through. Now it's at the API export step, and this will say that it's done in just a moment here. There we go, succeeded. I'm going to go back to my Bubble app and look at that. The window changed because it received all of the data that came in from Parabola, and I can see perfectly how I have these two new fields that I can now leverage in my application and save these to those user records where there is no first and last name value. So I'm going to go ahead and, also you see how the amount, since we changed the definition of the field type to a number, Bubble is also recognizing it as a number. So I'm going to hit save on this. Okay, now I can do something like this. I can make a change to a list of things, and the type of things will be user. And we're going to do a search for all users. And we want to update the names of the users based on the email address, because we know what their emails are. Under the transaction, every transaction has an email address, and every user also has an email address. So we're going to look up all users and say, all right, for this email, ted@test.com, you're going to give me the first and last name that was parsed out for any transactions where the email was also ted@test.com. That way it knows to put Ted Tester over here, first name Ted, last name Tester. So back to my API workflow, we'll search for users, and we're going to add a constraint. The email address of the user needs to equal the request data. This is the automated data that came in, all structured out for us. Email, customer email, right? So those need to match, right? Email needs to equal whatever came in from the data from Parabola. And then the thing that we're changing or updating is the first name and the last name. These are the fields in the user data type that are currently empty. They have no value. So this value will be the request data's first name. This is the new field Parabola created for us at the bottom. And then the last name will be the request data's last name down at the bottom. Great. So now we're going to run this so that we can actually see things changing here in our bubble database. So before I do, I need to remove that initialize word from the API endpoint. So I'm going to real quick unpublish this and then go back to my API export and just remove the word initialize. You can even remove that last forward slash. And we'll update the settings. Okay, and now I'm going to publish it again. Because again, the initialize is only to detect the data so that Bubble knows what the structure of the response is, and it can present the fields like this for us. We don't have to create these manually. Okay, so I'm going to go over to, now that the API workflow is set up, the Parabola flow is set up, I'm just going to come over here and we're going to run the Parabola flow and we're going to watch everything come in here and fill in nicely. So let's do that. I'll run now. We'll run now again. Okay, so this is running and it should update soon. If I refresh data, there they are. That was very, very quick, very helpful. So we have Ted Tester, Sue Williams, Jane Sample. Our names were all parsed out exactly how we wanted it to be. So this was a really, really quick, straightforward look at how you can connect your Bubble application data to a powerful data processing tool like Parabola. They really make every step as easy and straightforward as possible. Again, you can see that I did not write a single line of code in any of this. And anywhere that did get a little bit technical, there is plenty of documentation for Parabola and on the Bubble side, for creating privacy rules, for grabbing that URL. Bubble made it really easy. You hit detect data and you just copy it here. This isn't even a line of code. It's a URL for this endpoint. Once you start working with endpoints a little bit more, you'll really get comfortable with them pretty quickly. And when you look at the entire list of transform and destinations and sources, you can really see all of the different options and possibilities that are available to you. The real magic in all of this are these transform tools. This is where the processing happens. So if you take a look very closely and play around with this with some test data, see what Parabola can do with it for you to really save you some time and automate conversions of things, you can see that you can really build some powerful custom automations, which is awesome for any kind of application that is data heavy. All right, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and thanks so much for watching.